Hello guys, welcome to the video for assessment item 2 for NRS123. In this assessment we're asking you to do a case analysis, so there's a bit of a story to go along with the assessment that you're doing. It's worth 35% of your overall mark. It's due on the 10th of September, which will be due while you're out on placement or on the mid-session break. So there's no workplace learning associated with this subject in particular, but if you're studying NRS122, it's likely that you'll be placed in this mid-session break over that 4 weeks. What this means is, and you'll probably have other subjects with assessment items across a few weeks in that stage. It means that you need to not leave it until week 7, 8 or 9 to be doing this assessment item. It means you need to be working on it as soon as you finished assessment 1 really. You need to be putting together some of the information that you need and doing the early parts of the assessment well in advance of when it's due. We've looked at all the due dates across the different subjects, and we've made sure that they're at least sort of a week and a half apart from each other, and we've separated them. But there's no way to do this where we actually get to teach you the information that you need to know and then get you to do the assessment items without having them in the mid-session break and afterwards as well, and then also give you a little bit of time to study for the exams at the end. So it's just the nature of there's 3 months and we've got a bunch of assessments to get done across the different subjects. It means you need to be working on them progressively from the start of session. Your workplace learning will not be special consideration grounds for assessment item 2. It's something that you need to factor in at the start of session and prepare yourself for, and make sure that you've got time across those 4 weeks rather than I'm doing my workplace learning and then I'm also working extra shifts and working crazy hours over the other 2 weeks and then I'll just need an extension. That's not how it will work. You need to get your time organised to be able to do the assessment in the time that you've got available, because it's not due until week 9, so you've got sort of 2.5 months to be looking at the assignment and getting it put together. Don't leave it until the day it's due. It won't work well for you. It will be poor. It will not submit your best work if you're trying to write it on the due date. You need to write it with plenty of time. So it's worth 35%. It's due on the 10th of September. It'll be returned on the 3rd of October. The length is 1500 to 1700 words, so same as assessment item 1, instead of telling you it's 1600 words and letting you work out what plus or minus 10% is, I've made the assessment due from 1500 to 1700 words. It means any less than 1500 will be a breach of that rule, and any more than 1700 will be too many as well. So you need to get your paper to be within that number, and that excludes your reference list. So again, your in-text citations will count, your references to the bottom of your paper won't count, and you'll need to submit EASTs again, your paper through EASTs. So the task. In this subject you'll have learned about legal, professional and ethical considerations that apply to clinical nursing practice. In particular, you've learned about the scope of practice of a registered nurse, the impact that legislation has on nursing practice and the professional regulation of nursing in Australia. This assessment task allows you to explore the relationship between law and nursing. You're required to search peer-reviewed sources and Australian legislation to assist you in answering the following questions. So, first point before I get into it is that those things are things that we will do in class. We'll be going through legislation, going through cases, and going through these particular points of the content in the tutorials before you go and do the assignment. So we'll be doing that in the early few weeks, weeks 1 to 4 sort of thing. We'll be going through a lot of this stuff in there. So we will be covering it, we'll be looking at how you're going to do that, and you'll then go off and do the assessment by yourself. So, question 1, define and examine the term scope of practice in the context of a practice of a registered nurse. Use the case provided, which is the HCCCB Piper case, to support your examination of this term. It should take you around 400 words to answer that question. So you need to look at the term scope of practice, and a lot of students got that very confused last year. So we'll be looking at it in the tutorial carefully. We might generate some discussions about it on the discussion forum as well. Make sure that you're really clear about what scope of practice means, because it's a term that's used a lot in health, and health professionals sort of just tend to understand what it is, but a lot of beginning or new students to the idea that haven't done a lot of practice in the health setting, really it's an uncommon term for you. So it's important that you understand what it's all about, that you get a good definition from somewhere else. Don't just write what you think it is. Go and find a definition from a credible source, and then talk about the term, examine it. What does it mean? How does it apply to registered nurses? How does it change what they're able to do or what they're not able to do in their job? So do all that and then apply it specifically to the case that I've given you. So a case will allow you to pull apart that particular situation and work out what does scope of practice mean in that particular case. So that's question 1. Question 2, discuss the impact that each of the following examples of legislation has on the way that registered nurses must provide clinical care. Explain how the nurse in the case provided, the previous case, which is the Piper case, has breached these laws. So there's the Poisons and Therapeutics Goods Act, there's the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law. Those two laws are things that the nurse in that case has broken, that they haven't just been a bit naughty, they haven't done something that's just a little bit unethical, they have broken the law on both of those occasions. So explain how the nurse has done that, what particular parts of the laws have they broken, why was the actions that that nurse did illegal rather than just not a very good idea. So we're looking at the impact that the law has on our daily practice as registered nurses through that case by looking at particular laws that the nurse has broken. So that's question 2. Question 3 is to outline the specific actions that a registered nurse would be obliged to take if they were a witness to the events in this case. So this has gone from the first 2 questions are analysing what already exists. Question 3 is a hypothetical question, so there isn't a witness that I want you to talk about from the case. I want you to imagine that if there was a registered nurse that was witnessing what happened, everything that happened in that story, what would the registered nurse be obliged to do? And you're going to say report it, right? Because that's what everybody wrote last year in the assignment. It's more complicated than that. Legally, professionally, ethically, you've got things you're supposed to do that are more complicated than just report it. Certainly reporting it is one of the things you'll need to talk about. But there are other things the registered nurse needs to do. And it's not, again, it's not because I said so, it's not because it's a great idea, it just occurred to the nurse at the time. There are laws, ethical practices, and professional standards that a registered nurse must follow if they witness things that are unprofessional or unsafe. So you need to go through and work out what's happened in the case. Imagine a registered nurse saw all that. What would they have to do? And who says so? So looking at the 3 things I've given you there, you've got the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law. There are elements of that law that talk about what you're supposed to do if you witness unsafe or unprofessional practice. You need to look at the professional practice standards, and you can pick any element of that. So there's the RN standards for practice. You don't have to talk about all of them, but pick up one section of the registered nurse standards for practice and apply it to the case. Explain what the registered nurse would have to do based on those RN standards for practice. And then talk about the ethical principle of non-maleficence, which we'll look at in the classes a bit. And I've also got a link that I'll put the help with assessments page that talks about what non-maleficence is to some extent. But read about it. Talk to me about what non-maleficence is and why the nurses breach that ethical principle if they were to witness it and do nothing about it. So that's the question 3 is allowing a little bit more words, 500 words, to unpack what all 3 of those things would do to a witness of a nurse. Please don't spend 500 words talking about what the nurse in that situation did wrong, because you've done that already. You've already described that in question 2. So in question 3, you're imagining there is a witness that happened in that situation, someone that saw it that wasn't participating themselves, but what are they now obliged to do? So that's what that question is about. The assessment includes an introduction that orients the reader to the context and purpose of the paper. So you need to discuss the key points of what the paper will be about, so I have an understanding as I'm reading it what it means. The body that addresses the 3 assessment tasks questions properly, and then a conclusion that effectively summarises your discussion without adding any new information. There shouldn't be new references and new quotes and new interesting things that weren't in the body of your paper in your conclusion. Your conclusion is supposed to summarise and tell us what the most important parts of your paper are all about. So that's what that's about. In-text citations are counted in the word count, but the reference list is not. Sources. Your discussion needs to be supported with specific examples of legislation and credible sources of information to inform your understanding. So examples of appropriate sources include the prescribed text, the Staunton and Chiarella text, other legal textbooks. So you might look at law and health books. There might be legal health books. There might be legal nursing books. Both of those are fine. Federal or state Australian government websites. You're better off to stick to New South Wales because a lot of the discussion talks about New South Wales legislation, so it makes more sense to look at New South Wales stuff. Websites regulated by universities that are relevant to Australian legislation, so Austerly is something that we'll be looking at in class, and there are a couple of other sites like that that are good quality legislation sites, and scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles, so good quality journals. You can use those to support your discussion as well. Examples of sources that are not appropriate include social media sites, and there are some interesting sites that do talk about some of these issues that all seem great to use, but the point is all of the things I'm about to mention haven't been peer reviewed, they've never been regulated by anybody. So a social media site, I can write whatever I like and blog it or send it out, and you can read it and it can seem interesting, but no one's ever challenged that information. It might all be nonsense. So it's important that you're not using social media stuff or blogs or newspapers or unregulated stuff that's targeted at interest groups like just consumers and things, because it's not the quality of the information you're getting is probably not very good. So websites that are not controlled by Australian governments or education providers are not helpful. So that's the sources that you need to use. We'll be covering, I think, all of the learning outcomes. I think that's all of them in this assessment, so it's covering a lot of ground. And the other reason we're doing it is nurses deliver care within an environment that's heavily regulated by law and professional and ethical standards. So it's incredibly relevant to us. It's important that you're going out into the world as a registered nurse and understanding how those things affect your job. It's not a theoretical, oh yeah, I'll get to that one day and think about it. From the day you start practicing, if you are breaking the law, it doesn't matter whether you know about it or not, you're still breaking the law. Like there are elements about your job you'll need to understand from the first day you take over. So it's important to have an understanding of that as an undergraduate. This assessment will require you to demonstrate a theoretical understanding of the legal, ethical and professional requirements that relate to the provision of safe and competent nursing care. Okay, now looking at the rubric very briefly, I won't go through this in a lot of detail because frankly you're into a point where if you've done NRS123 and a few other subjects that you'll have looked at rubrics before. But define and examine the term scope of practice in the context of a registered nurse. So that's the first point. You need to understand what scope of practice is to be able to answer this first question. You need to be able to attach it to the case, so you can't just talk about scope of practice and then that's what scope of practice is at the end. It needs to be building in the case that I've given you and talking about how that nurse is actually going outside their scope of practice. And yeah, the way you do that, the level and depth that you've been able to get that answer to will change your mark from a pass up to a HT. Identify and discuss how specific legislation applies to nursing practice across a range of contexts. So with the legislation, you've either clearly identified how that affects nursing practice or you haven't, and again whether you've been able to build the case into your response or not. Point 3 will be discuss the legal, professional and ethical obligations that a registered nurse has when they witness unsafe or unprofessional practice. So again, if you've only really mentioned reporting and then maybe a couple of other things, you'll get a pass. If you're able to give us a more comprehensive answer and sort of apply it to the points that you've been given, so the legal, ethical and professional aspect of it, you'll score better in that area. Then the presentation and use of evidence. So if you do well with your spelling and your punctuation, you put your paragraphs together well, you use your introduction and conclusion well, that'll get you marks. And then the amount of sources and the quality of the sources that you use as well. If you use 20 sources that are no good, you still won't score particularly well in that area. If you use a large range of really great sources and you've used them well to punctuate important points of your paper, that will score well in this paper. And then your referencing, you'll score well for the way you do your citations and also the reference list, and you'll lose marks if you haven't done those well. And again, the Turnitin will be used to check your paper, so I'll do that. Presentation is very similar to the previous assessment, so it's identical to assessment 1. I've done that on purpose so that you're playing with the same rules as the first paper, and the referencing and text matching is all the same. So really the important parts about this one is using what you've learnt from assessment 1 in terms of how to write your paper and building it in to answer these 3 questions. Okay, so you've got till the 10th of September to write this paper, please be jumping on the discussion forums and be discussing it with each other and talking about what you're planning to do. You know, have some discussion around what does scope of practice mean and where does that come from, and what does it mean for nurses compared to other people and all that sort of stuff. Let's get talking about it so that it makes it easier to answer that question, because the previous year a lot of students misunderstood what it meant. So let's be talking about it, and let's work on that sort of understanding together, and then write your paper. Make sure you give yourself plenty of time. It's the sort of paper that you should be able to write after week 3 or 4 and be putting your stuff together. And once you get the feedback from assessment 1, to make sure that you've edited your paper well, but it should be completed well in advance of the due date if you've got workplace learning considerations. So that's assessment 2.